With the bonfire lit, the story begins.
United States. 4 friends enter a haunted forest to document the legend of the Slender Man. But one by one, they begin to disappear without a trace. What seemed like a simple exploration turns into a deadly game, where reality distorts and something much worse than the legend watches them. When the truth is revealed, it will be too late to escape. The biting wind whistled through the trees as Ethan adjusted the camera on his tripod, focusing on the dark entrance to the forest of Black Hollow. The night swallowed the contours of the trees as if the darkness were alive, and a smell of damp earth and rotting leaves permeated the air. He and his friends, Logan, Rachel, and Danny, had driven hours to this isolated spot, fueled by the promise of capturing something real. Oh, Slender Man. I still think this is a bad idea, Rachel muttered, hugging herself against the cold. Have you seen the forums? People say that whoever comes here is never seen again. Logan laughed, holding the flashlight and pointing it into the woods. And you believe that? It's just an urban legend. The most we will find here are some graffiti scribbles on trees. But Ethan wasn't so convinced. He had read detailed accounts, stories of people who entered the forest and felt something watching, something that never stepped on the ground, something that appeared in the corner of their eyes and disappeared when they tried to look directly. Many reports talked about static sounds in the silence of the forest and voices whispering names in the wind. The most disturbing thing was that some testimonies came from people who had left Black Hollow, but who, after a while, disappeared without a trace. Danny, the most skeptical of the group, held up the camera for an initial recording. Here we are, exploring Black Hollow, the most haunted forest in America. They say this place is the home of Slender Man, and our mission is to discover the truth. Does he really exist, or is he just another internet story? Ethan sighed and picked up his own camera. He knew that no matter what they found, views were guaranteed. Human beings had a morbid fascination with the unknown, but some doors once opened can never be closed again. Then, without further hesitation, they passed through the tree line and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. The darkness inside the forest seemed thicker, as if the night there was different from ordinary night. The air was cold, still. No leaves moved, no crickets chirped. The only sound was the rustle of the group's boots against the leaf-covered ground. Rachel held the flashlight steady, illuminating the narrow path. This is very strange. It doesn't even look like a normal forest. There should be animal noises, right? Danny snorted. Maybe the animals have more to do than play extras in our horror movie. But Ethan also felt the strangeness in the air. There was something in that forest. Something that you couldn't see but that you could feel. The feeling of being watched was almost overwhelming. After half an hour of walking, Logan saw something strange. Look at this. He pointed to a tree. Stuck in the trunk was a sheet of paper, held in place by a rusty nail. Ethan walked over and slowly pulled the paper out, feeling a shiver run down his spine as he read the scribbled words. He is here. Don't look back. Danny laughed nervously. Right. Are we now in the 8-page game? Who would have put this here? Muttered Rachel, looking around with a mix of curiosity and fear. That's when everyone heard. One distant whisper, almost imperceptible, as if the wind itself was calling their names. Ethan quickly turned back, eyes wide. But there was nothing. Just tall trees, motionless in the lantern light. The forest seemed wait. The silence that followed the whisper was worse than the sound itself. The group looked at each other, their breaths bated. It was as if the forest had closed in around them, sucking in any outside noise. No wind, no falling leaves, just an oppressive void. Ethan was the first to break the moment, turning his camera back on. Someone may have put this page here as a prank, but I didn't see any traces of people around. No recent paths? Rachel swallowed. And that whisper? Do you really want to pretend we didn't hear anything? Danny shook his head and forced a smile. Maybe it was the wind, or a psychological effect. The more scared we are, the more Our brain fills in the gaps, but then the sound came back, this time closer. One slurred and distorted whisper, which seemed to come from all directions at once. Rachel swung the flashlight the way they came, but the light revealed only the thick darkness between the trees. It was then that Logan gasped, pointing at his camera. Do you see this? On the camcorder screen, among the dark forest, there was a tall, slim silhouette. His face was just a featureless blur, and then, in the blink of an eye, it disappeared. Rachel let out a muffled scream. Ethan turned in the direction where the figure was supposed to be, but there was nothing there. Logan was shaking as he held the camera. That was a recording bug, right? Any flashlight reflection? But no one responded. Because at that moment, the silence of the forest was replaced by a rising static sound. The static sounded low at first, a strange hum that made your skin tingle. But as the group stood still, trying to understand what was happening, the sound became louder, much higher. And then, Danny, it disappeared. It was a matter of seconds. One moment, he was next to Ethan, looking at Logan's camera. The next instant, the sound of static reached a deafening peak, and when everyone blinked, Danny was no longer there. Danny? Rachel's voice shook as her flashlight swept through the darkness. Nothing. No sign of him. No sound of footsteps moving away. He simply ceased to exist there. That doesn't make sense, muttered Logan, pacing in circles. He was here, right by my side. How does someone disappear without a sound, without a trace? Ethan fell to his knees, looking at the ground covered in dry leaves. No sign of disturbance. No footprints indicating that Danny had run. Rachel was breathing quickly, trying to hold back crying. This is not normal. We have to get out of here. But when Ethan picked up his cell phone to try to call someone, he noticed a detail that made his blood run cold. The screen was completely blank. No connection bar, no Wi-Fi. No form of communication with the outside world. And that's when they noticed a terrifying new detail. Nailed to another tree, a little ahead, there was another sheet of paper, written by hand, with the same shaky letters as the first. Rachel approached, hesitantly, and read aloud. He takes out those who don't believe first. The group exchanged desperate looks. Danny was the most skeptical among them, always laughing, always doubting. Now, he had been the first to disappear. And Ethan began to wonder, were they next? The silence that followed was dense, almost palpable. Rachel was clutching the flashlight so tightly that her knuckles were white. Logan took short, rapid breaths, still pointing his camera at where Danny should be. But there was nothing. Ethan approached the tree where they found the second page. His heart was beating fast, and a terrifying thought began to take shape in his mind. If the note said that Slender Man takes out those who don't believe first, what would happen to the rest of them? Rachel interrupted her reverie. We can't leave him here. We have to look for Danny. And go where? Logan snapped, trying to stay calm. Didn't you see how he disappeared? As if he had been erased. As if it had never existed. The wind blew through the forest, but it was a strange wind. It didn't come from any specific direction. It seemed to involve all three at once. Rachel's flashlight blinked. Logan's camera viewfinder shook, and then there came a sound. Steps. Heavy, slow, and nearby. Ethan raised his flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. Just still trees and endless shadows. But the sound didn't stop. The footsteps were coming from all sides at the same time. The ground beneath their feet didn't shake, but it was as if an invisible crowd was walking around them, watching, waiting. Rachel pulled Ethan by the arm, eyes wide. We are not alone. Before anyone could respond, Logan shouted, Guys, look at this! He was pointing at his camera, which was now shaking violently. The screen was full of static, but for a split second an image appeared. A face. Or rather, the absence of one. The figure was standing among the trees, tall, slender, faceless, colorless, observing, and then the camera turned off by itself. That's when they realized. They weren't just being watched. They were being hunted. Rachel began to hyperventilate, trying to turn on the flashlight, which was now flickering as if something was interfering with it. Logan clutched the camera to his chest, eyes wide, breathing shallow. The thing was there. Even though they couldn't see it with the naked eye, the camera had captured it. And that was very close. Ethan grabbed them both by the arms. "We need to get out of here now." The three began running through the forest, avoiding trees and trying not to trip over roots hidden by the tall grass. The air was thick, stuffy, as if the forest had become a living labyrinth, a place where time and space warped. The path they had taken minutes before seemed to have disappeared. Then Rachel stopped abruptly, pointing at the floor. "Wait, look at this." On the ground, there were a series of symbols scrawled on rocks and logs. The same drawing was repeated several times, a circle with an X inside. 8, muttered Logan, counting the symbols around him. "There are 8 of them." Ethan felt a shiver run up his spine. He had seen this symbol before. It was the same one used on obscure forums to represent the presence of Slender Man. Rachel took Logan's camera and started filming the symbols. "This cannot be a coincidence. Someone left this here as a warning." But before they could analyze further, a new noise took over the forest. It was a low, growing sound, like an electronic buzz. A sound of static, and something else. Whispers, thousands of them, whispering their names. It was then that Ethan looked ahead and saw something that made his body freeze. In the middle of the darkness, a new page stuck to a tree. He approached slowly, his heart beating violently against his chest. With trembling fingers, he pulled out the sheet and read the words written on it. "You already see him." Ethan's breath hitched. Behind him, Rachel and Logan's eyes widened, their skin paling. He knew before he even turned around that something was standing right behind him. Something very loud, very thin, very wrong. The air became heavy. Ethan felt the presence behind him as if something was draining his strength, sucking the heat from his body. Rachel let out a choked sob, and Logan took a step back, shaking so hard the camera almost fell out of his hands. He knew that if he looked, there would be no turning back. But fear was greater than reason. Ethan turned his head slowly. Nothing, just shadowy trees and emptiness. But his body said otherwise. He was there. Rachel grabbed his arm. "We have to get out of here." His voice was strangled with terror, and the whispers around him were getting louder and louder. That's when Logan realized something. The cabin. He pointed to a point further ahead, where a small wooden building emerged from the trees, as if it had appeared there suddenly. They ran to it, pushing the creaky old door inside. The place stank of mold and rotten wood, and the only furniture was a dusty table and a shelf of books rotted with age. But it was what was on the table that made Ethan catch his breath. A diary. The pages were yellowed and fragile, written in shaky handwriting. Ethan opened one of them at random and read aloud. "He sees me. He always sees me. Close your eyes, don't listen to the whispers. Don't believe what he shows. He's not real. He's not real." Rachel covered her mouth, looking desperate. Who wrote this? Ethan turned the page and found a drawing scrawled heavily on the paper, as if someone had etched it with desperation. It was the figure of a faceless man, with abnormally long arms and tentacles emerging from his back. The last entry in the diary said just 3 words: "He wants more." Logan backed away, holding his head. No, it can't be real. But before they could react, the door behind them closed with a bang, throwing the entire cabin into darkness. And then, they heard breathing coming from the corner of the room. They were not alone. His breathing was deep, irregular, as if something gigantic and non-human was sneaking into the darkness of the cabin. Ethan felt every muscle in his body seize up. They were trapped. Rachel turned on the flashlight, her hands shaking so much that the light swayed around the room. The clarity revealed only old furniture and broken bookshelves. Nothing there. Or at least that's what it seemed like. Logan held the camera to his chest and whispered, "We're not alone." And then came the sound, a shuffling of feet, but not on the floor. Rachel raised the flashlight to the ceiling. The beam of light flickered over the rotten wood, and then froze on a pair of long, skinny legs bent impossibly, stuck to the ceiling as if something was crawling over them. Rachel screamed. Ethan pulled Logan by the arm and shot for the door, which moments before seemed stuck, but now opened by itself as if the forest was waiting for them. They ran into the dark night, the cold burning their skin as they ran away from the cabin. Whispers echoed everywhere. The trees seemed closer than before, as if they were closing in around them. That's when Rachel tripped. Ethan turned in time to see her fall to the ground, the flashlight rolling away. But before he could help her, he violently pulled her by the leg, dragging her across the earth as if invisible hands were claiming her. She screamed, struggling, her eyes wide with pure terror. "Help me!" Ethan and Logan ran to her, grabbing her arms and pulling her with all their might. It was a dispute between them, and something that shouldn't exist. For a brief moment, Ethan saw, between the logs, in the dim light, two long, pale hands emerged from the darkness, holding Rachel as if she were a toy. They pulled harder, and suddenly Rachel was released. She fell to the ground, shaking, eyes glassy. Ethan hugged her while Logan pointed the camera at the place where the hands had been. Nothing, just trees, just shadows. But Rachel gasped, turning her head slowly towards her friends. His face was paler than ever. "I saw him," she whispered. "I saw his face." The silence that followed Rachel's whisper was as heavy as the darkness around them. Did she see his face? That was impossible. The Slender Man had no face. Ethan held her shoulders, trying to get her to focus on him. "Rachel, what did you see?" She swallowed hard, her eyes wide and fixed on a distant point in the forest. He's not like they say. He has a face, or had, for a moment." Logan clutched the camera to his chest. This doesn't make sense." Rachel started to shake. "I don't know how to explain it. It was like a flash. He didn't want me to see, but for a second, I saw it, and it was familiar." Before Ethan could ask what she meant by that, something changed in the air. The cold suddenly increased as if an invisible presence was approaching. Rachel's flashlight blinked again, and Logan's camera made a strange clicking noise. Then, Ethan felt something. A sting in the back of your neck, as if invisible fingers were brushing your skin. He spun back, but there was nothing. Rachel took a step back, clutching her temples as if a violent pain was shooting through her head. "He's inside my mind," she whispered. The whispers grew louder. Logan gripped the camera tighter, his eyes frightened. Rachel started to laugh. Not a laugh of relief, but a low, strange laugh. That didn't seem like her. Ethan took a step back. "Rachel." She looked up. They were different. His iris seemed darker, too dilated. His smile was wide, uncomfortable. And then she said something that chilled Ethan's blood. "He wants you now." Ethan felt a deadly shiver run up his spine. Something was inside her. Something was controlling her. Logan took a hesitant step. "Rachel, are you okay?" Rachel continued to smile, but it was no longer her smile. Then, without warning, she ran into the forest, no flashlight, no camera, just disappearing into the darkness as if she was being guided by something no one else could see. Ethan and Logan screamed her name, but she didn't look back. And then, the whispers stopped. The forest fell into absolute silence. Rachel, it was no longer there. The void left by Rachel's absence was unbearable. She simply disappeared. Like Danny, as if it had never existed. Ethan and Logan stood there, panting, staring into the darkness between the trees. The silence was absolute, but the forest seemed viva, pulsing around them as if waiting for them to run, so it could catch them too. Logan lifted the camera with shaking hands. "We have to find her." But Ethan felt something different, something cold inside him. Rachel didn't want to be found, or worse, Rachel was no longer Rachel. They began to walk slowly, calling out to her. But the deeper they went into the forest, the stranger things got. The trees seemed will repeat, as if they were stuck in a loop. Circular symbols scrawled on tree bark were everywhere. And then Ethan saw something that made his blood run cold. On the ground next to a mossy rock was a broken camera. It was from Rachel. He knelt down and picked her up carefully. The screen was shaking with interference, but there was still a video recorded. He pressed play. The footage was distorted and unstable. Rachel appeared on the screen, walking alone in the forest, as if she were being pulled by an invisible force. She mumbled unintelligible things, but halfway through recording, his expression changed. She looked directly into the camera, and then smiled. The screen flickered with static and the recording changed. Now it showed something much worse. Ethan is alive himself and Logan exactly as they were now, as if someone was filming them right now. He felt his heart stop. Logan held his breath. Someone was there with them, and then the camera turned off by itself. That's when Ethan felt a warm whisper against the back of his neck. It's already too late. The whisper was like an icy shock running down Ethan's spine. Someone, or something, was close enough to breathe against her skin. He turned his body violently, his fists clenched, his heart about to explode in his chest. But there was nothing there, just twisted trees and endless darkness. Logan also quickly turned around, pointing the camera everywhere, sweat running down his forehead. "Say you heard that too." Ethan swallowed. "I heard." It was then that they both realized something even worse. The trees around have changed. The trail they followed, it no longer existed. The circular symbols that were once scattered around now covered every visible surface, as if they had been carved into the wood in a matter of seconds. It was as if the forest had changed its very structure around them. Logan held his head, breathing quick. "That doesn't make sense. That doesn't make any damn sense." Ethan tried to maintain control. "We need to keep moving. If we stand still, we will go crazy." But Logan shook his head frantically. Something was wrong with him. "What if that's what he wants?" Logan murmured, his tone different, shaky. "What if we're just feeding the thing?" Ethan narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about?" Logan raised the camera, pointing it at his own face. His eyes were sunken, too dark, as if exhausted, as if something was draining your energy. He smiled, an empty smile. "We're never getting out of here, Ethan," he said. But his voice didn't sound the same anymore. Ethan felt panic rising inside him. Logan was changing. How Rachel had changed before she disappeared. Before he could react, Logan raised the camera to film Ethan, and then muttered something that froze his blood. "I see him all the time." And then, without warning, Logan ran in the opposite direction, disappearing between the trees. "Logan!" Ethan shouted, running after him. But before he could reach it, the sound of static invaded the forest, and then, Logan, it disappeared. Like Danny. Like Rachel. Now, Ethan was alone, or worse. I wasn't. Ethan felt a cold cut into his skin, but it wasn't just the forest wind. It was something deeper. Something that came from inside him. He ran, lungs burning, flashlight shaking in his hand. "Logan!" His voice echoed, but there was no response. Just a silence, artificial, as if the sound could no longer exist there. His body instinctively stopped. He noticed. There was no more trail. There was no more direction. The forest, it had folded in on itself. Ethan spun on his heel. Each tree looked the same as the next, as if they were being moved around every time he blinked. Space was no longer reliable. He tried to activate the cell phone's GPS. No signal. That's when he noticed an even worse detail. In all the trees around you, there was the same circular symbol with an X in the middle. They were once rare. Now, they were everywhere. It was as if the forest was marking the territory, closing the exits. And then, he listened. Steps, slow, cold, accurate, but did not come from one direction. They were around him. Ethan froze, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His instinct screamed to run, but something inside him told him that it wouldn't make a difference. It was then that he saw. A few meters in front of him, in the middle of the trail, there was a new page stuck in a tree. The paper swayed gently, as if it had just been placed there. How if someone knew exactly where he was? With trembling fingers, Ethan reached over and tore out the page. The words written on it were like a punch to his chest. Don't look for the face. He is already in you. His stomach dropped. What did this mean? It was then that he realized something was strangely wrong with your vision. The shadows around him were moving, but he wasn't moving his head. Terror hit him like an electric shock. His eyes were seeing things they shouldn't see, and then, without warning, Logan's camera fell from the sky and crashed against the ground at his feet. Ethan looked up, and he saw something colossal watching him from the top of the trees. Ethan felt the air being knocked from his lungs. Above him, among the twisted branches, something immense watched him. It shouldn't be possible. Nothing should be that loud. The figure was thin, skeletal, its skin white as bones exposed to the moonlight. Its long arms hung from the trees as if it were a distorted puppet. The face? There wasn't, just an absence, an empty space where something human should be. And then, Ethan realized the worst part. It was moving without moving. Its eyes registered small jumps in space, as if it were blinking and the creature was teleporting. Millimeters ahead, always in the same posture, always a little closer. Logan's dropped camera made a hissing sound. Ethan looked down and saw the screen shaking, distorted by static. But there was a video recorded on it. With shaking hands, he pressed play. The recording began showing Logan running through the forest. His breathing labored. He was speaking, but the words were unrecognizable, as if the video itself was corrupted. Then he stopped running, and he looked directly into the camera. His eyes were black as space, no pupils, no emotion. He smiled, and then Logan started to speak. But his voice was Danny's. Ethan staggered back. Danny had been missing for hours. That was impossible. The footage flickered and Logan's face changed again. Now it was Rachel. And then, it was Ethan. Ethan watched himself on the screen with the same empty eyes, the same smile. That's when he heard the whisper behind him. You were always a part of him. He turned around and saw the truth. It was not just one entity. It was all his victims at the same time. Every person who disappeared into the forest, everyone who had been taken, still existed, but inside it. Ethan opened his mouth to scream, but the creature he moved with, a leap, and the world went dark. The world around Ethan disappeared. Everything became a dark and cold void. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, as if something was draining his energy. The silence was absolute, no forest, no trees, just him and the darkness. Then voices began to echo, familiar voices. Ethan, help me. His heart froze. It was Rachel. You need to get out of here, please. Danny. And finally a third voice, hoarse, frightened, suffocated by despair. Your own voice. Ethan turned around, eyes wide. And he saw it. There, in the middle of the darkness, was a silhouette. Tall, thin, faceless. But she was trembling. As if it wasn't just one, as if there were many. Ethan saw faces appearing in the darkness, forming and fading inside the creature. Rachel, Danny, Logan, and for a brief moment, he saw himself, his body locked up. He never had a chance. The forest was never an ordinary trap. She was a cycle. Slender Man wasn't just a monster. He was an entity made up of all those who came before him. And now, he was next. The whispers grew louder, and the world began to shake. Ethan tried to run, but his feet, they no longer belonged to him. Ethan tried to scream, but no sound came out of his mouth. His body no longer responded. He was no longer in control. Faces continued to appear inside the creature, like shadows trapped in an empty shell. Rachel, Danny, Logan, they were alive, but at the same time, They weren't. Ethan felt his vision fail. The world was fragmenting. Time was no longer linear. He saw flashes of moments he didn't remember experiencing. A child crying in the middle of the forest. Lost. A man in a suit holding a page, writing frantically. Woman screaming as she was dragged into the darkness, and finally, himself, standing in the middle of the trees, watching. He was inside the creature, or worse, he was the creature. Time twisted around him, and Ethan felt his body being torn, a part remade, molded into something new, something that should never exist. It was then that he saw the reflection of his own hand, white, skinny, too long. The transformation had begun, and there was no turning back. Ethan's panic dissolved into something worse. Acceptance. He no longer felt his feet touch the ground. His body was stretching in an impossible way. He tried to remember his own name, but the memory slipped like sand between his fingers. Who was he again? The flickering reflection in a puddle of water in front of him. But the face he saw was not his own. Era empty. No traces. No identity. The last spark of humanity within him writhed in despair. He was still Ethan, right? But voices whispered around him, familiar and dark. We all go through it. You are part of it now. Just accept it. The last thing left of Ethan screamed inside your own mind, but outside, there was no more mouth to scream. Time ceased to exist. What was the past? What was present? Ethan no longer knew. His body dissolved into darkness, molded into something beyond human understanding. He no longer had a face. I didn't need one. He felt like he was floating among the trees, like a weightless shadow, as if it had always been there. So he listened. Footsteps in the forest, muffled laughter, and in the distance, excited voices. Let's film this. This forest has sinister stories. Ethan tried to fight the urge, tried to remember who he was, but he couldn't, why he knew what came next. The cycle was starting again, and this time he was the one waiting in the darkness. The forest was alive again. The once absolute silence was broken by the sound of hurried footsteps, flashing lanterns and nervous laughter. Another group had arrived. Ethan tried to scream, to warn them, to tell them that run away from there before it was too late. But there was no more voice. He was just a tall, motionless presence, blended into the darkness of the forest, observing, waiting. Then one of the newcomers stopped near a tree. He found the first page. Ethan didn't want to move, but I had no choice. It was as if the forest was pulling him, as if an invisible force was pulling him, forcing him to continue the cycle. It was then that he realized the most terrifying truth of all. I remembered being in that boy's place. He remembered of holding a flashlight, of carrying a camera, of laughing at danger. But now, he was the one in the dark. And for the first time, he understood what it was like to be Slender Man. The young people continued through the forest exactly as he had done before, carefree, curious, innocent. Ethan, or what was left of him, tried to resist. But the entity within him was stronger. It wasn't Ethan anymore, there was no one else. Now he was just the observer. And then, it happened. The first of them stopped. He looked around, feeling something strange in the air. Did you guys hear that? Another laughed. I heard nothing but your fear. But it was too late. The game had started. And now, they belonged to the forest. Static rose in the air, and flashlight lights flickered. And when the first of them looked back, he was there. Ethan, Logan, Danny, Rachel, Todos, united into a single entity. The silence broke. The first scream echoed through the night. The curse would never end. The camera shook on the ground, capturing only shadows and the flickering light of abandoned lanterns. The screams echoed through the forest, but one by one, they were silent. The image on the camcorder screen showed one last glimpse, the tall, thin silhouette motionless among the trees. The video stopped, static took over, and then absolute silence. Days later, the camera was found by a search group. No body, no trace of the young people. The footage was only watched once before disappearing from police archives. And in the last scene, something impossible happened. For a split second before the video ends, Slender Man tilted his head as if he knew he was being watched. The screen went dark. And then, amidst the digital silence, a new file appeared on its own on the memory card. The name of the video? Your next MP4.